and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higginbotham, and I'll be your host for today's program. On the third Thursday of October, every 3 years, a survey is done of how many people are homeless in the state of Minnesota. We're going to learn more about that study tonight and what the results are with our two guests who both work at Wilder Research. Stephanie Nelson-Dushek, welcome Stephanie.
Thank you.
And Melissa Decker-Gerard.
Michelle.
It's great to have you both here, and I've been looking at these surveys every 3 years. Unfortunately, they haven't changed a lot, actually, over the many years. And so when did you first start doing it?
Yeah, Wilder Research has been doing the homeless study since 1991.
91, so
Yes.
that's 91, that's almost 20
30
years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yep.
28 years.
almost 30 years.
Yeah. And we still have homeless people.
Yes, and the percent has actually gone up since our previous study in 2015 by about 10%.
So I guess we don't want to get too far into it, but we will get back to why that is. But first, let's learn a little bit about how you do it. I noted that there were 10,223 people that you surveyed that night.
So the homeless study is made up of two parts. And it's a huge effort, a huge collaborative effort that takes place around Minnesota, and we have stakeholders at the state of Minnesota and American Indian reservations and volunteer interviewers, and like I said, the two parts are really face-to-face interviews with people who are homeless on one night in October, and we tried to do as many in-depth interviews with those folks to get really at the characteristics of people who are homeless and what their experiences are. And then there's a count that we do in tandem with that. And that count where we try to count everyone.
And that's men, women, children?
Yep, everyone we can find. And that's the 10,233 number that we saw, where we saw the 10% increase.
Now, it's interesting to me because it's 200 questions. Do they literally
Yes.
ask that many questions?
Yeah,
How long does it take?
It can take anywhere from maybe 30 to 40 minutes to over an hour.
And they get $10.
They get compensation, people, and it's people who want to. So we go out to shelters and sites across Minnesota, again, collaborating with partners to sort of set up interview sites. And then we sit down and have volunteer interviewers help us do the survey. And it's a lot of questions, and if people don't want to do the survey or want to skip questions, they're absolutely welcome to.
But they still get counted.
They get to have their stipend at the end.
Oh, well, I was thinking more, they're part of the 10,000, whether they answer the survey or not.
So that 10,000 is more of the count, and then the interviews are actually fewer than that.
I would
It's
think
just
so.
more of the deeper dive into the data.
Well, how have the numbers changed as far as who's homeless?
Over the course of time of doing this study, when we first started doing this study, we found about 3,000 people that were homeless. So
Really?
Yeah, so it's really, the numbers have really
That's
shot
3
up.
times.
Yeah, yeah. So what we saw was kind of this increase during the 90s. And then in the 2000, when the economy was doing really well, between 2000 and 2006 or so, it flattened out. The population flattened out. And then we saw this steep rise during the Great Recession. That's when we saw the really big jump of 25%. And so right now in our homeless population, the number of children that we see in the population is greater than the entire amount we counted the whole population when we first started doing the study in 91.
The number of children.
Yes, there's more than 3,000 children who are homeless on any given night. And so that's one of the big ways the population has changed, is that a lot more families are experiencing homelessness. When we first started doing this study, it was a lot more singles.
Now, the other thing that's interesting when you say families, a lot of these are families, working families, right?
Yes, yeah. The people we talk to are experiencing homelessness are not necessarily unemployed. They have jobs maybe or income coming in. So I think to Michelle's point, when we think about homelessness, a lot of times people picture sort of the person who's standing maybe at the corner of 94 and 35 panhandling, which is certainly one picture of homelessness, but almost half of the homeless population is 24 and under. So we're talking
24 and
under. So we're talking children and youth making up the biggest sort of proportion. So really it looks different. It's not a homogeneous population. There's very different ways that people can come into homelessness and different populations experiencing homelessness.
Well, now, so you go to these different places on that one night of the year, and exactly, is it under bridges? Is it soup kitchens? Where do you go?
Yeah, we go to as many shelter sites as we can find and sort of set up interviews there. And then we do a lot of, and especially Michelle and our colleagues at Wilder Research do a lot of work to sort of go around the state and set up outreach sites at places like you mentioned, like drop-in centers or feeding sites or even under bridges, or Michelle was interviewing on trains in the middle of the night. And we did interview at the encampments too, at the Hiawatha encampment and the St. Paul Cathedral Hill encampment.
Now, have the places where people go changed in those almost 30 years?
Well, so part of the limitations of the study is we don't know what we can't find. So the population of people experiencing homelessness are not very visible. So we know that we're just getting the tip of the iceberg every single time we do the study. Last year there was a lot of visibility of people who were staying outside. There was a lot of news coverage of the encampments, particularly in the Twin Cities. But people don't realize that all the time there's people that are homeless in their communities and that they're just kind of invisible. So you might have somebody staying in their car and not know it. You might have somebody staying at a truck stop and using the shower at the truck stop and not know it, or using the shower at the Y or whatever. So we do, like in rural Minnesota, homelessness looks different. People might be staying in cabins that are unfit for year-round use, just like sort of summer cabins, and staying there year-round. Or fish houses, we've heard about that too, or camping in the woods. So, there's the whole gamut, from abandoned buildings to cars to even if you're staying temporarily doubled up with a friend or a family for a night on their couch, and then the next night you might be staying on the train, and the next night you might be staying outside. So when you ask how it's changed, we don't actually really know, because we never actually think that we found everybody who is homeless on a given night.
Is quite a few.
It is quite a few.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that you might not even know that your neighbor is homeless, because they might be, you probably would know your neighbor, but somebody that you know could be in a car or could be couch surfing or whatever. And they would be going to work every day.
Absolutely, yeah. About a third of our homeless population is employed. So that's sort of a little bit of a myth breaker, I think, is that, but the income that they make isn't making enough to pay the bills, to pay for rent.
Well,
That's
we need
the
to
critical
talk
issue.
about the housing situation, because obviously that plays into this. Why can't people get a place to live?
Sure. So we know that there is a real lack of affordable housing across Minnesota, and Minnesota Housing Partnership recently released their State of the State report that showed that median rent and housing costs have increased. And so I think it showed rent median costs are about $900 per month for an apartment. And I can't remember if that's Twin Cities or Minnesota, but from our survey we know that adults are reporting median income of $550 a month. So there's just this huge gap.
So in other words, even if you paid your whole salary, you still couldn't afford an apartment, and then you wouldn't be able to eat.
Yes, and even people, I think, we know colleagues who are looking for apartments, and even capacity is just low. Even if you're not homeless, it's hard to find an affordable rental unit. And so, so if you're homeless, it's just, insurmountable.
Well, now, we used to have Section 8 vouchers, and we still do have some kind of vouchers, but how long do you have to wait before one of those comes your way?
Sure, yeah, I think we have an average wait time of 12 months from our study.
And if you're a mother with children, you
Yeah.
need a larger apartment?
Right, those are really hard to find. So that was actually in our study this year, we found that there was actually a slight decrease in the number of children who were homeless, just like about a 1% decrease, and a big decrease in the number of families that were homeless, 5% decrease. But most of those families we think were the smaller families and not the families with a lot of children. Those apartments are really hard to find,
Why
especially
do you think
affordable.
there was a smaller number of families that were homeless? That's a good thing.
It's a good news part of the study. Sometimes our study can get really depressing.
This
and
one
so,
did.
yeah, and so we do want to make sure that we point out some of the good work that's happening in our state and some of the focus areas right now are trying to get those families into housing as quickly as possible.
What is the difference between the urban areas and the rural areas? Is there more? I mean, we think there's more homelessness in the urban areas because we can see it more.
Sure. If you look at the whole population, the percentage is higher in the Twin Cities, but there was actually a bigger increase in Greater Minnesota. So we talked about that 10% increase at the beginning. It's actually 13 in Greater Minnesota. In some parts of Minnesota, it's even higher. So it's there, maybe not quite as much as in the Twin Cities, but it's increasing, and it's, like Michelle was saying, it's not as visible, so it's almost harder to tackle.
To see who really is homeless.
Yes.
And I would guess that there's a lot of shame involved too.
Sure,
Absolutely.
So people don't want anybody to know.
Right, that label is a hard label to say that you're homeless, and I think that's one of the things. Sometimes we go up to people and ask them to participate in our survey, and they're like, "We're not homeless," but they don't have a place to stay.
Right.
So they don't consider themselves homeless. But
Where
they
are
don't,
they? Why do they not consider themselves homeless?
I think because of the stigma that you're talking about. They don't want to think about themselves. They think about maybe a perception in their head of who that should be, and
It's not me,
them.
is what it
yeah,
is. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, you can
exactly.
understand that. Well, now the housing situation has changed, hasn't it? I mean, apartments are a lot more expensive now than they were a long time ago. Everything is more expensive, but housing seems to be significantly more expensive. Is that true?
Absolutely. The price of housing has gone up for everybody. And the vacancy rate right now in the Twin Cities is hovering between 1% and 2%. It's just really hard. So landlords can charge more because there's a lot of competition for the same housing. And you talked about that Section 8 voucher, which is so critical to this population because that allows them only to pay about 30% of their income for housing rather than maybe 50, 60%. And in our study, we found about half the people were, on a waiting list for Section 8 housing. So they're waiting, but there's not a lot of landlords that will take people with Section 8, not a lot of those types of units available.
So it really isn't an answer at all. I mean, it's a tiny answer to a very large problem.
Right, and well, and we've talked a lot about the increase in homelessness, but in terms of looking more at the population, they're facing all sorts of factors. You talked about the stigma of being homeless, but then in our data we saw there's this big increase in people saying they're experiencing significant mental illness, and that's potentially always a barrier to getting housing. You may have a criminal background, which is preventing them from getting an apartment unit or housing. Physical health issues. So there are a lot of factors that are sort of confounding the issue of being homeless that are working against somebody.
Well, when I looked at the study, the statistics, at least half of the people seem to have some kind of mental illness, a physical disability, or something that kept them maybe even from getting a job and making it worse.
And those numbers have certainly only gone up since the beginning, since 1991. And so this year, like you were saying, we saw, I think it was over 60% had a serious mental illness and physical issues for sure. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I was just going to add, when we look at the homeless population, I think, again, like Stephanie said, it's really diverse. And so there's a certain proportion of the homeless population that just needs an apartment, just needs a place to stay. They got a job, they're doing okay, and they just need affordable housing that matches their income. And then there's this other portion of the population that really need a lot of services as well. They're not quite getting the support they need. And so that's another cut of the population.
and that's the part that must be much harder. I mean, I would assume that some people actually need to have no stairs or room for a personal attendant to be with them or something like that.
Yeah, and that need is going to be growing, because another big thing that we found is that, well, they make up more sort of the smaller group of people who are homeless. The increase in older adult homelessness is huge, 25%.
I did notice that really is getting,
Yeah, so we're seeing, and we've got baby boomer generation and more older adults, and certainly that increase is showing up in our study as well, that more people who are older are homeless.
Now, I noticed when I was looking at the statistics that among the younger population, there were more girls or women, the younger people. But as it got older, there were more men who were homeless. Is there a reason, do you think, for that? Why the difference between, or why it sort of switched as they got older?
Yeah, it sort of goes back to there are a lot of different ways that people can come into homelessness, and and certainly when we look at things like past, adverse childhood experiences, we call them, and things like history of sexual violence or exploitation and physical abuse, that tends to happen more among women or girls. And
So back up a step.
Sure.
So adverse childhood,
experiences, yeah.
do you want to,
Say what those are? Sure.
it can be,
Yeah,
there
it's
can be a
more
lot
of
of things.
Yep, it's based on an actual study that was done by the CDC.
By the CDC, yeah.
And so years ago, but it's sort of a general term for any number of things that could have happened on 18 and under. And there's sort of a number of categories. In our study, we've picked a select number of what we call adverse childhood experiences, and that is, physical abuse, having someone in the home who uses substances, experiencing sexual violence, I'm trying to forget, and having a parent who's incarcerated. I think so. So any of those things that might, affect outcomes or things in your life later on in your life.
It's, maybe we try to ignore the fact that parenting is really important. I mean, it sounded from what you said and what I read also that if you have a mom or a dad who has a substance problem or is violent, that affects that child and is more likely to be homeless.
Yeah,
Sure.
what we see is in the homeless population is this impact of generational poverty. And that can be related to trauma, and so the trauma can be passed down through the generations. If you had a bad experience as a child, then sometimes that works itself out in the next generation as well. So I think that there's a lot of factors in play here, and some of it has to do with generational trauma or childhood trauma. Some of it has to do with histories of racism in our society that have disproportionately impacted our African American and American Indian communities, and that's caused trauma too. So like childhood trauma can happen in different ways depending on the circumstance.
Well, it was interesting to me to find that was the case, because you don't really think that the homeless population today is probably also, they've been traumatized and they're going to re-traumatize their children. I mean, as you said, it's going to be it's a generational thing that it's not going to stop.
It can be, I mean, many people have experienced trauma in their childhoods. A lot of people have had at least one, adverse experience in their childhood. But for this population, it just piles up. There's a bunch of them, and all these things factor together, and it can really impact your ability to function as an adult. So
Got enough? You've got just one more problem added to all the other problems that you have.
exactly.
Well, you said that something about the shelters. People weren't going to the shelters as much. Why is that?
Well, I think that, so like you said, we saw this big increase in the number of people who were staying outside of the shelter system.
Why is that?
And I don't know if it's that people are not going to shelters, the shelters are full. And so everyone's at capacity. And so at least I think that, people are going in, like we talked about, getting on these waiting lists and just not being able to get in. So then
So
have
they
to find
had to
another,
be outside
yes.
because they. Now I remember that there was one, I can't remember, researcher who said, not a Wilder person, who said, well, we shouldn't build more shelters because that's not solving the problem. Is that, now from your work in the field, what do you think?
Yeah, and for years, we didn't want to build more shelters because we want to solve the problem of homelessness, right? And shelter doesn't solve it. That
Right,
doesn't
that
give
was
somebody
it.
a permanent place to live. And so that is a, really interesting viewpoint, and I, agree with it in a lot of ways, but I think what's happened right now is basically people are in crisis situations and they're turning to the streets in a big new way. And so there needs to be a safety net in place first to get people at least stabilized. We find that if people are in shelter, then we're able to provide services for them. We're able to connect them with something. So if they have a mental health issue, maybe a counselor or a therapist. If they have a physical health issue, we can take care of that. Healthcare for the Homeless is a great program that helps get those types of needs met. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, is actually we've kind of run out of those emergency spaces, and Actually, just in this most recent budget, there was some one-time funding passed to help with just those emergency services. The critical long-term solution is housing, obviously, with services, but the emergency situation that we're seeing right now on the trains and in campsites and
So we have to do something now because people need to find a way, but we need to look at a long-term solution.
Absolutely.
Right. And
yeah.
we know too from other studies beyond the homeless study that housing in itself is sort of an intervention that will improve outcomes for people. Like you can imagine if you're homeless and have a serious mental health issue, or if you're an older adult and have just had surgery, you're not going to heal or get better being on the street. So having housing to really is the first thing that people need to improve their mental health, improve their physical health, or if you are experiencing substance use disorder, like being discharged from a program into homelessness, for example, it will only decrease your likelihood of staying sober. So.
Well, I know that there are some, I don't know what they call them, not dry houses too. I mean, you can go even if you're an active user. Is that a good idea?
So we
Is
call
it a necessity?
Right.
Yeah.
So we have a approach that a lot of providers use now called housing first. So that's kind of what Stephanie was talking about. Provide the housing first before you deal with any of the other issues.
Because that is the key.
That's the key. Right. That is critical to that. Get them stable and sheltered, and then they can work on some of those issues. So if they're an alcoholic, they can work on improving that situation, but it's impossible if they're on the street. So
that it's a realistic way of looking at things, sort of.
And it seems to work. So there's been studies of this approach, and it actually has better impact than approaches that force people right away to get sober. Those programs before they've even dealt with the housing crisis, right?
That was the old way.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we need to talk about youth. There are too many young people, according to your study, who are out on the streets. Do they go to the shelters? I mean, and is it safe for them to go to the shelters?
Yeah, they certainly do, and there are youth-specific places and Housing and Wilder operates a couple of youth-specific housing sites, and again, youth have a very different experience and why they're homeless. A lot of what we're finding is, maybe somebody was kicked out of their home for identifying as LGBTQ, or just having a disagreement with their parents, or just not be kicked out in some way. And so maybe Michelle can speak more to whether it's safe or not.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're lucky in Minnesota. We have amazing youth service providers in our state, and so there are a lot of youth-specific. Well, not a lot, but some
more
youth-specific shelter programs where people are really good at working with youth. They're youth workers. They're used to it, and they know how to connect with youth. The issue with youth, I think that's not as well known, is that some of our youth are unable to get into those shelters, and they're staying in the adult shelter system. So we do have some parenting youth who are staying in some of our large family shelters. And so that's where a number of youth are staying as well with their children. And then we have youth that may not have a youth shelter in their community, and so need to stay in the family or the adult shelter system. I think that providers are trying to be cognizant of the needs of youth, and they do the best they can, but sometimes there's a capacity issue, and they're staying with other folks, who have had all kinds of different issues in their lives. So.
Is it the lesser of two evils? I mean, I've heard young people say that they don't feel safe in the shelter, that they're going to be abused further.
Yeah, and our study doesn't really get into that. We do have a question on the survey asking people if they've been physically attacked or beaten while they were homeless. And so, and a lot of our homeless population is really vulnerable, not just the youth, the full population from 0 to 80, right? So they're very vulnerable. They're doing what they can to get by day to day, right? And so for our youth, we're particularly concerned, but we have these great youth workers. So if they can get connected to a youth worker, it's very helpful for them.
Now, there are school programs, aren't there, for little kids who are going to living in the shelter and they still can go to school? How does that work?
Yeah, the McKinney-Vento.
Yeah, so we had the great Bruce Vento in Minnesota as our congressman, and he nationally passed a law that requires school districts to really focus on the needs of homeless children and youth who are in their districts. So one of the things that they do is they bus children to their home school, even if they're staying in a shelter elsewhere.
So they go back to where they...
Right, so they don't have to experience that disruption. So that's a really cool thing. And then there's some special services that they can provide for those kids. It's not enough, obviously. There's more kids than there are McKinney-Vento coordinators in schools, but it is a really good step and allows some continuity for those kids.
Well, as we've gone around and around, and what you've said is that we just need more housing. And so why don't we have more housing?
That's a really good question. Why don't we have more housing?
I mean, we just have to face the fact that that is the question.
Right. And I think it's housing. It's more housing, but I do want to emphasize too that it's more. We need more mental health, access and people, other things beyond maybe just housing. It's housing plus sort of the, are we addressing health issues? Are we addressing sort of systemic race issues? All sorts of things that are coming together to.
Another study that Stephanie and I worked on a couple of years ago was looking at home rehab for older adults and what would it take to keep them in their homes so that they wouldn't move into more like assisted living or apartments, and so that they could stay in their own homes. And that's a critical piece of the picture as well, because we have a lot of older adults and a lot more coming down the road. And so if we can fix that, again, another prevention piece.
Well, and the multi-generational things too, where a young couple will move in with an older person because they can't afford an apartment, and then they can provide some care for this
Exactly.
older person.
I think we do need to think really creatively. There's the traditional build housing solutions, but there's also co-living. That idea of the multi-generational thing is a really cool idea. We used to have a lot of single room apartments, like studios, and we've gotten kind of into the builders have built more of the fancy places, that type of thing, and this population can't afford to live in that type of environment.
So we need some of those sort of just an apartment.
Just an apartment, and then we also need more apartments that have services available for the people with complex needs.
And so the problem really then is not just housing, we've decided. It's really something housing plus.
Yeah.
But it also, it sounds to me like what you said is it really starts with babies and children and having them raised without the adverse childhood experience that you've talked about.
It can be for sure, but there are certainly people, and I can't remember, or people who are older and experiencing homelessness for the first time.
So there are
also an issue.
It sounds to me like there are many reasons for homelessness.
Yeah.
I hope you've learned a little bit tonight, you are our audience, about what causes homelessness, who the homeless are, and maybe give you some things to think about. How could we end homelessness? Our guests this evening have been Stephanie Nelson-Dushek and Michelle Decker-Gerard from Welder Research. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thanks for having us.
And Joan Higginbotham for the League of Women Voters saying thanks for tuning in to We the People. Good night.